Hello everyone, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of this YouTube channel, Reformed GGA, and today I'm continuing the series on how to safely handle semi-auto firearms. And specifically today we're going to be talking about grip and stance. And grip and stance has to do with handling the recoil of a firearm. Anytime you have an action that occurs, the basic laws of motion, basic classic Newtonian physics, says that for any action there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction. In the case of a gun, you have an explosion in the chamber that sends a projectile down the barrel and out of the gun towards the target at very high speed. That is the primary action that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to put a bullet on target. However, because that action is happening that way towards the target, there's going to have to be an equal and opposite action that goes the other way, which is towards you. That is, the bullet's going to leave the gun, but the gun is also going to be trying to go the other direction. And our job as the shooter is to control the gun so that it's not out of control. We will go ahead and we'll start with handguns because they are easily, of the two major classes of gun, handguns versus long guns, of the two major classes, handguns are the ones that are typically the hardest to control. It's very hard to be accurate with a handgun, especially over great ranges. There's a lot of people that would say that handguns are really only best 25 yards and in. Some people would say more like 70 yards and in. But however you look at it, they're not really great for long range because they're very, very hard to control by comparison. So let's take a look at one and talk a little bit about grip and stance. All right, so this is a fairly typical semi-auto handgun. This one's already been checked and cleared off camera. So we're safe and good, which is what we should always do when we're talking about things like this and we're experimenting with our grip and our stance and all that kind of thing. All right, the grip that I'm going to show you guys with this is the modern classic, not an ancient classic, but the modern classic of the two-handed thumb on both sides grip. And it starts with the dominant hand. I'm right-handed, so we'll start with the dominant hand. And the first thing that you want to do is to get your dominant hand's web between the thumb and the forefinger, that webbing that's in the middle there. You want to get it as high in the grip as you can without the impeding the movement of the slide itself. So a lot of guns will have a little bit of a protrusion on the back that keeps your hand from getting actually caught in the slide itself, which is a good thing. And that little protrusion is usually either called the tang or the beaver tail, depending on its size. And it is there to keep you from getting too high. So if your gun does have a tang or a beaver tail, go ahead and try to get as high up in there as you possibly can. Because the higher you grip the gun, the easier the recoil is going to be to control. Now, this is a two-handed grip, and so we'll get to the other hand in a moment. But right now I want to show you a tendency that a lot of people have that results in a problem. And that is that you will notice right now, my forearm as a whole, its center of mass is below the center of my wrist, which means that if I were to fire the gun right now, what would happen is, of course, bullet goes down range, and then my gun is going to have a reaction that is in proportion to that, meaning that it's going to try to move back. But as it tries to move back, because my wrist, the center of my wrist is much higher than my forearm, what's going to happen is it's going to tend to rotate the gun. So the gun is going to try to move back, and because of the way that I have my forearm positioned relative to my wrist, the gun is going to have a tendency to tilt up. So when we're shooting, one of the things that we need to be very conscious of is where our forearm is relative to the center of our wrist. We don't want it low like this. Instead, we want our forearm to be raised so that the center of our wrist and the center of our forearm are on the same horizontal plane as much as possible. That way, we've already got some tension in the wrist, and it's going to be easier to resist that backward and upward movement that the gun is going to try to force our hand to do. So we don't want a low arm, we want a high forearm. Right, but I said this was a two-handed grip, so now I'll go ahead and show you the other side. So on the other side, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a gap that my dominant hand leaves behind. My dominant hand can't quite get around the gun entirely, and that's normal and that's fine. What that does is it gives you another spot to grip with your non-dominant hand. So using the heel of my non-dominant hand, I'm going to find that little spot that my other hand can't fill, and I'm going to put the heel of my non-dominant hand in that spot. And then my fingers are going to wrap around, and I'm going to be squeezing my other hand and that blank spot on the grip together. And it's actually my non-dominant hand that does most of the work of gripping. My dominant hand, I want to leave it just a little loose. I still need to hold on to the gun, so I can't let it be completely limp. But my dominant hand, I want to be using for firing the weapon, and I want to have good control of that. So I don't want my dominant hand to be squeezing super, super, super tight so that I start shaking and shaking and shaking and shaking, and who knows where the bullet goes. No. I want my dominant hand to be nice and high. I want my forearm to be relatively high relative to the center of my wrist. But I don't want to be really overexerting this hand and trying to grip the gun. If I do that, then I'm not going to have good control over the trigger. My shots are going to wind up going wild, and that's not a good thing. So instead, when I take my dominant hand and I fill in that spot with my heel and wrap my fingers around, I get a really, really super tight grip with my non-dominant hand. It's what's doing most of the gripping job. And then my non-dominant thumb comes and it presses on the frame, not on the slide, on the frame, because the slide's going to reciprocate, so putting your finger there would not be a wise idea. But on the frame, get it as nice and tight as I can, and then my other thumb, my dominant thumb, is going to come behind that and lock my first thumb in place. And so this is the thumbs forward on the same side of the gun grip that is fairly standard these days. Lots of people use it. And then in terms of what the rest of our body looks like, what I'm going to suggest is that you start with the Weaver stance. And the Weaver stance is kind of a modified rifle stance. What happens is that as you're squaring up to the target, your dominant shoulder moves back a little bit. And so as you raise the gun up, if your dominant side moves back a little bit, that means that your dominant arm, you're going to be able to keep relatively straight, but you should still have the elbow bent a little bit. When the gun recoils, you want your elbows to be able to take that force. Okay, you want your body to be fairly stable, but your arms can move out a little bit, and remember to keep your forearms high relative to your wrist. Okay. So, if I move my dominant shoulder back regarding whatever my target is, then my dominant arm is going to extend a bit more. You still want it to bend at the shoulder, but the trade-off is that my other arm, my non-dominant arm, its elbow is typically going to be much more bent when I do this. So, dominant arm is relatively straight, still bent at the elbow, and then my non-dominant arm tends to bend quite a bit more. And that means that my dominant arm is going to wind up taking most of the recoil. But like I said, my non-dominant hand is what provides most of the grip to keep my other fingers tight. Okay, so my non-dominant hand is tight. My dominant hand is a little bit looser. You still need to hold on to the gun. You still want it to be somewhat tight, but it doesn't do the main work. Okay. And then as far as arms, your dominant arm should be relatively straight, still bent at the elbow. The non-dominant arm is quite a bit more bent. And remember to keep your forearms high relative to your wrists. And then you raise the whole thing up until it's at eye level. And then once it's at eye level, then you can go ahead and start getting on position to fire and all that. And play a little bit with just how bent your elbows are. The closer into it usually is going to be more stable, but there's also more chance that it's going to come back and conk you in the head. So you don't want to be too close. But if you're super far out and super extended, then you have more of a tendency to shake because everything's hyperextended. So you need to play around with it a little bit, going back and forth a little bit to figure out where you're the most stable. Watch the sights, see where they bounce around the least, and is still a comfortable distance away from your own face. And then once you find out where that comfort zone is, then you can go ahead and you can take a shot. Okay. So, again, dominant hand gets as high under the tang or beaver tail as you can. Get a nice tight grip around the gun. Keep your forearms high relative to your wrists, not down here, because then it's going to try to tip back on you, and that's not good. Keep your forearms high relative to your wrist. The non-dominant heel fills in that spot on the grip that your dominant hand can't fill in. Okay. Your fingers wrap around and hold your other fingers in place. Non-dominant thumb goes on the frame, and then dominant thumb comes back and holds that in place. Once you're squared up to the target, your dominant shoulder comes back just a little bit. Your elbows go up, and then push out and come back a little bit until you find where your sweet spot of controllability is versus getting so close that it conks you in the head. Okay. Usually you want to be fairly well extended, and then come back from there until you feel like you've got good control. Make sure that your non-dominant hand is the one that's doing most of the squeezing on the gun. And then when you're ready and everything's good to go, you can let it break. And of course, that's after you're at the firing line with the barrel pointed safely downrange and all those kinds of things. Okay, so dominant hand wraps around. There'll be a blank space on the other side. Your heel of your non-dominant hand goes there. Fingers wrap around nice and tight. Thumb down, thumb down. Forearms high relative to your wrists. Elbows slightly bent. Go ahead and play with the distance a little bit. Try to get further out, but not so far out that you start shaking and losing control. And then once you're comfortable that you're in a good spot, your non-dominant hand is providing most of the grip, then you'll be good to go. All right. Now let's talk about our footwork just a little bit. All right, so in terms of what your feet are doing, there's lots of different stances that are out there that are used for lots of different things. I'm not trying to comment on all that. But for simple recreational shooting, the upward body stance that I showed you is part of what is called the Weaver stance, and it involves both the upper body and lower body. So I already told you about throwing back the dominant shoulder to make your dominant arm a little bit straighter. But that also involves the dominant leg as well. If you move back the dominant shoulder, you should also move back the dominant leg. And so what's going to happen to your feet when that other leg comes back is it's going to open up your toes a bit. So your non-dominant foot is still going to be pointing towards the target, but the other foot is going to come back off to the side a little bit. That provides a little bit more stability, and then once you've taken basically a step back with your dominant side, you're going to bend the non-dominant knee so that you start leaning forward a little bit, and you're going to feel a little off-center on this one because you're going to be leaning forward when you do that. And then your entire upper body also starts to lean a little bit forward as well. So from standing, move the dominant side back. The front leg, which will be your non-dominant leg, bends a little bit, and then your entire upper torso bends forward a little bit as well. And moving all of that mass forward is going to give you greater recoil control. You should always feel like you are behind and over your gun. You should never feel like you do when you do this. Because if I'm leaning back like this, then I'm behind and underneath the gun, and the recoil is not going to be controlled. To control the recoil, you need to be firmly behind it and you need to be over it. You're going to hold it down, you're going to keep it on target, you're going to control the motion of that machine. Alright, so again, grip, blink spot, Feel with the non-dominant palm, get my fingers wrapped around that. Thumb down, thumb down. Okay, work on my feet. My dominant foot is pointing off to the side a little bit. My non-dominant foot is pointing towards the target. I bend the front knee a little bit. My entire torso also bends forward a little bit. Keep your forearms high relative to your wrists. Bring the sights up to your eye line, and then once you're on target and you feel like you're in good control, then you can go ahead and pull the trigger. Provided you're at the firing line, the range is hot, all those kinds of things. All right, and then for long guns, it's pretty much the same thing. This one was also checked and cleared off camera. Again, your dominant hand is going to be the one that's holding the primary grip of the gun. Your non-dominant hand, though, instead of gripping your other hand, you've got a lot more real estate on a long gun. And the basic idea is to grip basically as far forward as you can, and then you're going to pull that into you. You're still going to keep your dominant foot back and out a little bit. Your non-dominant foot is still going to point towards the target. Your dominant shoulder is going to come back just a little bit, and that should keep you on target relatively well. One point of contention is exactly where on your shoulder you place the stock of the gun. The old way of doing it, which isn't necessarily bad, but it does have a downside that I'll talk about. The old way of doing it is to basically put it right on the socket joint of the shoulder. And the reason for doing that back in the day was so that you could move your shoulder forward and keep the stock from wanting to come out to the side. And if you're dealing with a fairly powerful gun, that makes a lot of sense so that you can control it. However, a good many modern semi-autos, they're not all that powerful. And so you don't actually need the shoulder coming over the side to keep the stock in place. And so as a modern way of doing it, a lot of times it's actually more convenient and also a lot less likely to bruise is if you bring the stock more central and more so on the ribs that you would have here, not on the collarbone, because that's actually fairly easy to break, but down actually on the ribs. And as long as you're leaning forward enough that you can get good solid contact on the stock, what you don't want is something like this, where I can get my fingers behind part of the stock. The lower, what is called the toe of the stock, that is on my chest right now, but you'll notice that I have a lot of space behind that stock where I can get fingers. But if I lean forward, then I fill up that spot and I can't get my fingers back there anymore. And that's what I want. The more of that stock that is in contact with my chest, and especially on the ribs, not on the collarbone, not in the socket area, but actually on my ribs, the more firm my connection to the gun is going to be. And that means that when the gun recoils, my whole body is going to move, and that's actually what I want, because that's what controls the gun, and it's also what prevents bruising up there. If you're standing too upright and you don't have good contact on the stock, that little part that actually is connected to you is going to exert a lot of pressure in that one little spot, and you're going to wind up with a bruise and it's going to hurt. But if I lean forward so that I get more contact and I'm pressing on a relatively hard part of my chest right on the ribs, then there's not really going to be any secondary motion, and I'm going to be able to avoid bruises and that ouch kind of feeling that you get when you have something that really presses up against you quickly. If I'm already at full contact and my non-dominant hand is actively pulling that gun into me, I shouldn't have to hold it with my dominant hand. It's just there to pull the trigger. If I'm actively pulling back, so it's nice and tight and I've got good coverage here, the chances of getting a bruise are very, very, very minimal. Sorry. That does bring us to another topic, and that is some alternatives on grip and stance that some people are sometimes advised to do, but frankly I would not advise to do them. One of them involves handguns, and it is the teacup method. So there are some people that are directed to use a teacup grip when they're shooting, and that is you have your dominant hand in a fairly conventional grip, and then your non-dominant hand comes under and you hold it like a little teacup. This is absolutely terrible for recoil control. It is often used when the gun is too heavy for the person so that you have something underneath the gun to hold it up. Problem is that as soon as the gun recoils, they've usually got their forearms low relative to the wrists, and so what happens is the gun comes back, they completely lose control, lose contact with the non-dominant hand, and the gun tends to kick up and flail in all kinds of directions, and you're not in control anymore, and that's not good. Okay. So, don't teacup it. Yes, that helps you lift heavy things, but if the gun's that heavy, you probably shouldn't be shooting it in the first place if you can't control it without getting under it. Now, it should be in front, and that will help keep the grip from coming forward and the muzzle going up. Okay, you're about controlling the recoil, not controlling gravity. So, non-dominant hand should go around your other hand. It shouldn't be under. Under, no. Around and on top, yes. Okay. And remember, keep the forearms high relative to your wrists. All right, and then with long guns, sometimes it will be suggested that if you're having a difficult time with a long gun, that you should shoot it, down here from the hip, like they do in the 80s action movies. That's not in control. You can't aim effectively that way. And also, depending on how you'll hold the gun, you'll notice that sometimes that can put your wrist in a really weird place. And if you're shooting something that's really powerful, like a 12-gauge shotgun, that can actually damage your wrist. And of course, if you have your trigger finger in the trigger guard when it is happening, which you pulled the trigger, so it's probably going to be, then you have a good chance that the trigger guard itself is going to come back and hit your trigger finger, and that's really going to hurt. So, firing from the hip looks cool in the 80s action movies, and back in the day when most guns were relatively heavy and just the weight itself would absorb the recoil, it actually wasn't all that bad. But nowadays most guns are fairly light, and firing a fairly light gun, especially one with heavy recoil like one of the light shotguns, not really a good plan. So I would suggest staying away from hip firing. I would suggest staying away from the teacup grip. All right, that's all the basics that I had for you guys on that one. Hopefully it made sense. Thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know him. He is the only genuine Lord of Lords, and he is the only genuine Savior. Amen.